The American Civil War, 1861–1865, was a conflict between the United States of America, Union, and the Confederate States of America, Confederacy. It was primarily fought over issues of slavery, states' rights, and sectionalism. Here's an IDC overview: causes slavery. The primary and most divisive issue was the institution of slavery. The Southern economy relied heavily on enslaved labor, particularly for agriculture, e.g. cotton, tobacco, while the northern states were industrializing and increasingly opposed to slavery. States' rights. Southern states believed they had the right to govern themselves, including the right to permit slavery, and opposed what they viewed as northern interference. Sectionalism. Cultural, economic, and political differences between the North and South grew over decades, leading to mistrust and resentment. Election of Abraham Lincoln, 1860. Lincoln's election as president, on a platform to prevent the expansion of slavery, prompted Southern states to secede. Key events: secession. 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, beginning with South Carolina in December 1860, and formed the Confederacy under President Jefferson Davis. Start of the war. The war began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Major battles: Battle of Antietam, 1862, the bloodiest single-day battle in American history; Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, a turning point in the war, resulting in a Union victory; Siege of Vicksburg, 1863, gave the Union control of the Mississippi River. Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. Issued by President Lincoln, it declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held territories, shifting the war's focus to ending slavery. Surrender, Confederate. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Court House on April 9, 1865. Aftermath: human cost. Over 600,000 soldiers died, making it the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. Abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, 1865, abolished slavery in the United States. Reconstruction Era, 1865–1877. The Union worked to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into society, though this period was marked by significant challenges, resistance, and racial tensions. Duration of the war. Start: April 12, 1861, with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. End: April 9, 1865, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Court House, though some minor skirmishes continued afterward. Outcomes of the war. End of slavery. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States. The war marked the legal end of slavery but left lasting racial and social inequalities. Reunification of the Union, the secessionist. Confederate states were defeated and reintegrated into the United States. The principle that states cannot secede from the Union was firmly established. Major changes in American society. Reconstruction Era, 1865–1877. Efforts to rebuild the South and grant rights to formerly enslaved people. This included the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, ensuring voting rights for African American men. Economic transformation. The war accelerated industrialization in the North and left the Southern economy in ruins, forcing it to adapt. Federal power. The federal government emerged stronger, with increased authority over states. Social struggles. The war set the stage for future civil rights movements, as racial segregation, discrimination, and violence against African Americans persisted. The issue of slavery. Importance of slavery in the Southern states. The Southern economy was heavily dependent on slavery for labor-intensive crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Wealth and political power in the South were tied to the plantation system and the institution of slavery. Anti-slavery sentiment in the North. The North had transitioned to industrialization and wage labor, reducing its reliance on enslaved people. Abolitionist movements grew stronger, with activists like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, advocating for the end of slavery. Many Northerners opposed slavery's expansion into new territories, fearing it would give Southern states more power. The Missouri Compromise, 1820, and Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. The Missouri Compromise maintained a balance between free and slave states by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, prohibiting slavery north of the 36°30' latitude. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed territories to decide on slavery through popular sovereignty, leading to violent conflict in Bleeding Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed. States' rights versus federal government, the doctrine of states' rights. Southern states argued they had the right to govern themselves, including the authority to allow slavery. They believed in a decentralized federal system, where states retained significant power. Secession was justified as an exercise of states' sovereignty when they felt the federal government threatened their way of life. The doctrine of federal government power. The North, under leaders like Abraham Lincoln, believed in a strong federal government with the authority to preserve the Union. Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery and maintained that secession was unconstitutional. Economic differences. Economic differences between the North and South. The North was industrial and urban, focusing on manufacturing, trade, and wage labor. It supported tariffs to protect its industries. The South was agrarian and rural, relying on plantations and enslaved labor. It opposed tariffs, which made imported goods more expensive. Industrial North versus agricultural South. The North's growing industries and infrastructure, railroads, factories, created a modern economy less reliant on slavery. The South's economy was deeply tied to cash crops like cotton, which required a large enslaved workforce to remain profitable. Attack on Fort Sumter, beginning of the war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. This marked the official start of the Civil War. The Union garrison surrendered, rallying Northern support for the war, while the Confederacy solidified its resolve to fight for independence. Major campaigns and battles. Battle of Gettysburg, July 1 to 3, 1863. The turning point of the war, fought in Pennsylvania. Union forces, led by General George Meade, defeated Confederate General Robert E. Lee's second invasion of the North. The Union victory inflicted heavy casualties and halted the Confederacy's momentum. Lincoln later delivered the Gettysburg Address, redefining the war's purpose as a fight for freedom and democracy. Siege of Vicksburg, May 18, July 4, 1863. Led by Union General Ulysses S. Grant, the Union Army besieged the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. The victory gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. This was a crucial blow to the Confederate war effort. Sherman's March to the Sea, November-December 1864. General William Tecumseh Sherman led a devastating campaign through Georgia, capturing Atlanta and marching to Savannah. Sherman used total war tactics, destroying infrastructure, railroads, and crops to weaken the South's ability to fight and demoralize its civilian population. Abraham Lincoln and his role. Emancipation Proclamation, January 1, 1863. Lincoln issued this executive order, declaring freedom for enslaved people in 9 Confederate-held territories. While it didn't immediately free all enslaved people, it shifted the focus of the war to ending slavery and discouraged foreign nations, e.g., Britain and France, from supporting the Confederacy. It also allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, bolstering its forces. Leadership and vision. Lincoln's primary goal was to preserve the Union, but he later expanded it to include the abolition of slavery. His ability to rally public support and manage political factions was critical to the Union's success. Northern and Southern armies, Northern strategies and leadership. Anaconda Plan. The Union sought to blockade Southern ports and control the Mississippi River, strangling the Confederacy's economy. Leaders like Ulysses S. Grant and William Sherman implemented aggressive strategies to defeat Confederate forces. The North had superior resources, including industrial production, railroads, and a larger population. Southern strategies and leadership. The Confederacy aimed to defend its territory and outlast Northern resolve. hoping to gain foreign recognition and support. General Robert E. Lee led the Confederate Army with skill, earning several victories despite limited resources. The South relied on its knowledge of local terrain and the determination of its soldiers to counter the Union's advantages. 1. Surrender at Appomattox Court House, end of the war. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Court House, Virginia. Grant offered generous terms to Lee's army, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and promising not to prosecute them for treason. While other Confederate forces surrendered in the following weeks, this event marked the effective end of the Civil War. End of slavery 13th Amendment. Ratified in December 1865, it abolished slavery throughout the United States. The amendment permanently outlawed involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. It was a monumental step toward civil rights, but left many formerly enslaved individuals facing poverty, discrimination, and systemic inequality. Reconstruction Era, 1865-1877, Reconstruction of the Southern States. The Union sought to rebuild the South, which had been devastated by war. Infrastructure, cities, and economies were in ruins. Southern states were required to rejoin the Union by drafting new constitutions, abolishing slavery, and accepting federal authority. New constitutions and laws. The 14th Amendment, 1868, granted citizenship to all people born in the U.S., including formerly enslaved individuals, and guaranteed equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, 1870, granted African American men the right to vote. Reconstruction governments, often led by African Americans and Northern allies, implemented reforms such as public schools and infrastructure projects. Challenges. Southern resistance. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation to oppose Reconstruction efforts. End of Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction, leading to the withdrawal of federal troops and the rise of discriminatory Jim Crow laws in the South. Impact of the war on American society. Political changes. The federal government emerged as the dominant power over the states, ending debates over secession and states' rights. The war redefined the Constitution, ensuring greater protection of individual rights. Social changes. The abolition of slavery created a massive societal shift, but racial discrimination and segregation persisted for over a century. Women's roles expanded during the war as they took on jobs in factories, farms, and hospitals, laying the groundwork for future gender equality movements. Economic changes. The North's industrial economy grew stronger, cementing the U.S. as an emerging industrial power. The South, heavily dependent on agriculture, struggled to rebuild without enslaved labor, resulting in widespread poverty and sharecropping systems. Significance of the American Civil War. One of the most important events in American history. The Civil War was a pivotal moment that shaped the United States as a unified nation. It resolved the fundamental question of whether states could secede from the Union and ended the institution of slavery, fundamentally altering the nation's trajectory. Lasting impact on American society and culture. The war laid the groundwork for civil rights movements and debates about race and equality that persist today. It also influenced art, literature, and collective memory, with figures like Abraham Lincoln and events like the Gettysburg Address continuing to symbolize ideals of liberty and unity. Lessons for modern society. Issues of racism and inequality. Despite the abolition of slavery, systemic racism and inequality endured through segregation, disenfranchisement, and economic disparities. The Civil War reminds us of the importance of addressing these issues to create a more equitable society. Lessons about conflict. The war illustrates the devastating consequences of deep societal divisions. It underscores the need for dialogue, compromise, and unity in the face of political and cultural differences. Additional suggestions for presentation visuals include maps to show the division between the Union and Confederacy, key battles, and the path of Sherman's march. Use historical images, such as those of Lincoln, soldiers, and Reconstruction efforts, To engage the audience. Incorporate short video clips or reenactments for emotional impact. Interviews. Include insights from historians or Civil War experts to provide depth and authority. Highlight personal stories of soldiers, abolitionists, and civilians from the period. Reconstruction Era. Spend more time on Reconstruction, emphasizing its successes and failures in rebuilding the South and integrating freed African Americans into society. Different perspectives. Present views from both the North and South, including why individuals fought, their beliefs, and their experiences during and after the war. Share the perspectives of enslaved people, abolitionists, women, and Native Americans to provide a more comprehensive understanding. Modern relevance. Draw parallels between the Civil War struggles and today's issues of racial justice, political polarization, and federal versus state power. Discuss how the war's legacy still influences American identity, democracy, and the ongoing quest for equality.